The string quartet had just finished a piece when the little girl in the yellow dress tugged on Robert Halloway's sleeve. He almost didn't notice her. At 68, in a room full of senators, hospital board chairs, and men who wanted a piece of his construction empire, Robert had trained himself to filter out anything that didn't matter. A 3-year-old shouldn't have registered at all. But she pulled harder, and when he looked down, she wasn't smiling the way children usually smiled at him. The practiced, coached smile of a donor's grandchild paraded out for a photo. She was staring past him at the young caterer refilling water glasses 2 tables away, and she said it so plainly, so certain of herself, that the whole corner of the ballroom seemed to go quiet around it. "Look at her birthmark, sir. It's the same as yours." Robert's hand found the edge of the table before he understood why he needed it there. He looked at the caterer, late 20s, dark hair pulled back, a coffee-colored mark shaped like a comma just below her collarbone, half hidden by her blouse. He had seen that exact mark, that exact shape, every day for 31 years, on his late wife Margaret's collarbone, and on his daughter Claire's, in the crook of her neck where he used to kiss her goodnight. Claire, who had been dead for 19 years. He set down his water glass because his hand had started to shake, and the ice cubes rattled against the crystal loud enough that 2 people turned to look. Marcus, his son, was already moving toward him from across the room, weaving between tables with the too quick, too careful walk of a man trying not to look alarmed. "Dad, you okay?" Robert didn't answer. He was still looking at the young woman with the water pitcher, who had just noticed she was being watched and was smoothing her collar self-consciously, unaware that a man worth $400 million had just seen a ghost standing 3 feet away from him, pouring ice water into a stranger's glass. 2 months earlier, none of this would have happened, because Robert Halloway didn't attend charity galas anymore. He had built Halloway Construction from a single crew laying foundations in Charleston in 1979 into a company that put up hospitals and highways across 4 states, and for most of his life, the work itself had been the reward. But 3 years ago, Margaret's heart had given out in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while she was deadheading roses in the garden she loved more than anything except her family. And since then, galas felt like rooms full of people wearing his wife's absence like it wasn't there. He'd only come tonight because the hospital wing being dedicated bore Margaret's name, and because Marcus had asked twice, gently, in the voice he used when he actually meant something. Marcus was 51 now, prematurely gray at the temples, and he ran the day-to-day of Halloway Construction with a competence that made Robert quietly proud even when he didn't say so enough. Marcus's wife, Deborah, handled the foundation, the charitable arm, the galas, the ribbon cuttings, with a polish that made everyone comment on what a natural she was. They had 2 grown children of their own, both away at school, and a marriage that from the outside looked like the kind of thing people build magazine profiles around. From the inside, Robert sometimes wondered. He'd never been able to name it precisely. Deborah was never anything but warm to him. She remembered his coffee order, sent flowers on Margaret's birthday every year without fail, called him Dad in a way that had taken years to stop sounding rehearsed. And yet there was something in the way she managed information around him, which calls got through, which papers landed on his desk and which quietly didn't, that made him feel on his worst days like a resident of his own company rather than its founder. He hadn't thought much about it in months. He'd been thinking instead about the will. At 68, with his cardiologist using words like manage more than cure, Robert had finally agreed to sit down with his estate attorney and finalize the document that would determine what happened to Halloway Construction, to the foundation, to the house on Sullivan's Island when he was gone. Marcus and Deborah had been, in his estimation, remarkably patient about a process that would directly shape their family's future. He'd taken that as a good sign. He was starting to reconsider. The morning after the gala, Robert sat in his study with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and a name written on a legal pad, Sarah Whitfield. He'd gotten it from the catering company, claiming he wanted to compliment the staff. It had taken 1 phone call and considerably less charm than he expected to need. Sarah Whitfield, 29. He didn't know anything else about her yet, but he knew the shape of the mark on her collarbone the way he knew the shape of his own hands. And he knew that Claire had died in a car accident on a rain-slicked road outside Asheville in the autumn of Robert's 49th year, and that Claire's daughter, his granddaughter, not yet 2 years old at the time, had died with her. That was what the sheriff's report said. That was what he had been told, sitting in this same study, by a state trooper with kind eyes and an unbearable voice, 19 years ago. There had been a funeral, 2 small caskets, because there had been nothing left to properly separate. He had wept at that funeral in a way he had never wept before or since, not even for Margaret, because Margaret's death had been the end of a long shared life, and Claire's had been the end of everything that might have still happened. He had not spoken to Claire in the 4 years before she died. That was the wound underneath the wound, the one that never closed. She had left at 25 after a fight so ugly he still couldn't remember, honestly, who had said the worst thing first. Something about the man she was seeing, someone Robert had called unfit for her in front of the whole family at Christmas dinner. Someone Deborah, newly married into the family herself, had quietly agreed with. Claire had packed a bag that night and driven off into a Charleston rainstorm, and the next real news Robert had of her was a phone call, years later, informing him she was dead, and that she had a daughter he'd never met, and that both of them were gone. He had told himself for 19 years that he deserved that grief, because he'd let pride keep him silent for 4 years when a phone call, any phone call, might have brought her home before the accident ever happened. Now there was a woman with his dead wife's birthmark pouring water at a gala, and his hands would not stop shaking. He found her 3 days later, not through the catering company. He didn't want this handled by a lawyer or a private investigator yet, not until he understood what he was looking at, but by driving to the small blue house on Ashwood Lane, where the catering manager, after considerably more charm than the first phone call had required, admitted Sarah lived with her daughter. The little girl in the yellow dress answered the door before her mother could stop her, looked up at Robert with the same open, unafraid curiosity she'd shown at the gala, and said, "You're the man from the party." "I am," Robert said. "My name's Robert." "I'm Lily. I'm 3.5. Sarah appeared behind her daughter with the particular tightness of a young single mother who has learned through hard experience to be wary of unfamiliar men on her doorstep. Up close, in daylight, the resemblance to Claire was less like a photograph and more like an echo. The set of the jaw, the way she stood with her weight on one hip, arms half-crossed, ready to close the door. "Can I help you?" "My name is Robert Halloway," he said, and watched something flicker behind her eyes at the surname. Recognition, maybe, of the name on half the buildings downtown. "I was at the gala the other night. Your daughter said something to me. About a birthmark." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone. "Lily says a lot of things. She's 3. "I'd like 5 minutes of your time," Robert said. "I promise you it isn't what you think. I'm not selling anything, and I'm not—" He stopped because he genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence without sounding unhinged. "I'm not sure if you might be my granddaughter, who I was told died 19 years ago. I just need to ask you a few questions about your family, if that's all right." Sarah studied him for a long moment, the way people do when they're deciding whether a stranger is dangerous or simply strange, and something about his face, old, tired, genuinely uncertain, must have tipped the scale, because she stepped back and let him in. She had been raised in foster care, she told him, sitting across from him at a kitchen table with a crayon drawing taped to its edge. She'd been placed with the Whitfield family at 18 months old, after, and here her voice dropped, the way people's voices drop around old grief they've made peace with but not comfort, after her birth mother died in a car accident. She didn't remember any of it. She only had a manila folder of paperwork the state had given her when she aged out of the system, half of it redacted, a name that might have been her birth mother's first name, Claire, and the birthmark, which the file noted only as an identifying feature, present at birth. Robert sat very still through all of it, because if he moved, he thought he might come apart entirely. "There was another child," he said carefully, when he trusted his voice. "In the accident. A woman and her daughter, both reported dead, outside Asheville, 19 years ago this October." Sarah went pale in a way that mirrored almost exactly the way he must have looked 2 nights before. "That's the date on my intake paperwork is October of that year. County file. I never looked into where I came from before. It felt like poking at something that couldn't be fixed." "I think," Robert said. And the words came out smaller and more fragile than he had said anything in years. "I think you might have been the little girl in that car. I think you might have survived, and somehow, in the confusion, the county records and my family's information never connected. "I think your mother might have been my daughter." Lily, coloring quietly at the end of the table, looked up at exactly that moment and said with the total confidence of a 3-year-old who has just understood something the adults had been circling for 10 minutes, "Are you my great-grandpa?" Nobody answered her. Sarah had both hands pressed over her mouth, and Robert realized, distantly, that he was crying for the second time in this house's short acquaintance with him, and he did not particularly care. DNA didn't lie, and it didn't take long once Robert had a lab and a check and the kind of urgency $400 million can buy. 19 days later, in this same kitchen, a genetic counselor with careful hands and a gentle voice confirmed what both of them had already begun to believe in their bones. Sarah Whitfield was Robert Halloway's granddaughter, daughter of Claire Halloway, and this was the part that broke something open in Robert's chest all over again. The county coroner's report from 19 years ago listed the deceased female child as unidentified, approximate age 18 months, never definitively matched to the Halloway family file, because in the chaos of a multi-vehicle accident on a flooded highway, an unrelated toddler pulled from a wrecked minivan 2 cars back had been misidentified in the initial triage, and Sarah, thrown clear, found by a passing trucker 40 yards from the wreck, unconscious but alive, had been logged separately, admitted to a children's hospital under a Jane Doe designation, and placed into foster care 6 weeks later when no family came forward to claim her. No family came forward because no family had been told to look. That was the detail that sat wrong in Robert's stomach for days afterward, needling at him at 3 in the morning. Somebody should have been told to look. Somebody had handled the identification of Claire's body, because it had been identified, definitively, dental records confirmed. And somebody should have asked, at some point in 19 years, whether the child in that car had truly been recovered or only assumed to be. He didn't yet know who that somebody was, but the question had lodged itself under his ribs like a splinter, and it would not stop working its way deeper. He told Marcus and Deborah at Sunday dinner, 3 weeks after the gala, because he could no longer stand to sit across the table from them holding a secret this large. Marcus's reaction was what Robert expected: stunned silence, then a slow dawning genuine joy, his eyes going bright and wet as he said his sister's name out loud for the first time in what felt like years. He stood up from the table and hugged his father with the kind of force that knocked the breath half out of him. Dad, she's alive. She's actually, I have to meet her. When can I meet her?" Deborah's reaction took Robert longer to place, because on its surface it looked identical to Marcus's. The same soft gasp, the same hand over her heart, the same murmured, "Oh, Robert, that's a miracle." But he had spent 30 years reading rooms full of men trying to hide bad news behind good manners, and something about the half-second delay before Deborah's face arranged itself into joy sat wrong in a way he couldn't yet articulate. "We'll want to be careful," Deborah said, once the first wave had passed, once the wine had been poured and Marcus was already reaching for his phone to look up flights to arrange a family visit. There are people who prey on situations like this. A young woman turns up claiming to be a long-lost heir. "Robert, I'm not saying she's lying. I'm saying we need lawyers involved before anyone gets too far ahead of themselves." "We've already done the DNA test," Robert said. "She's not claiming anything. She didn't even know my name until I showed up at her door." "I just think," Deborah said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes, "that we should be thoughtful about how quickly things move, for everyone's sake." Robert let it go that night, because he wanted, more than he wanted to be right, to simply sit with the fact of Sarah and Lily existing in the world. But the phrase stayed with him, for everyone's sake, turning over and over in his mind long after Marcus and Deborah had left, long after the house had gone quiet, until it had worn a groove. The first letter turned up 9 days later. It was Marcus who found it, of all people, going through a storage unit that had held Margaret's things since her death. Old photo albums, a cedar chest of letters and cards Robert hadn't had the heart to sort through. Marcus had volunteered to do it, thinking he was helping his father with a task too painful to face alone. And instead, he'd called Robert from the storage facility, his voice unsteady in a way Robert had rarely heard from his composed, unflappable son. "Dad, you need to come down here." There were 11 letters, all addressed to Robert, all in Claire's handwriting, all postmarked from a small town outside Asheville, all dated in the 2 years after she left home, and every single one of them had been opened, read, and never answered. Robert had never seen them before in his life. He sat on an overturned packing crate in a climate-controlled storage unit and read his dead daughter's handwriting for the first time in 19 years. And what he read broke something in him that had been quietly, secretly whole until that moment. She wasn't angry in the letters. That was the thing he couldn't get past. She wasn't demanding an apology or rehashing the fight. She was homesick. She wrote about missing the smell of Margaret's kitchen, about a man she'd met, not the one from the Christmas fight, a different man, kind, steady, a school teacher, about being pregnant, about being scared, about wanting more than anything for her father to meet her daughter before too much more time slipped away. The last letter, dated 4 months before the accident, was the shortest. I know Deborah's told you I don't want to hear from you. That's not true, Dad. I've never said that to her. I don't know why she'd tell you that, but please don't believe it. Please call me. I have a little girl now. I named her after Mom's mother. I want you to know your granddaughter. Robert read that line 4 times before he understood fully what it meant. Deborah's told you I don't want to hear from you, he said out loud, to the empty storage unit, to Marcus standing frozen beside him. I never told Deborah anything like that. I never spoke to Deborah about Claire at all in those years. I couldn't. Marcus had gone very still. Dad, there has to be an explanation. Maybe Claire misunderstood something. Maybe it's a mix-up. 11 letters, Marcus. Opened. Never shown to me. And somebody told my daughter I didn't want to hear from her. Robert's hands, holding the last letter, had started shaking again. The same tremor from the gala, except this time it wasn't grief driving it. It was something colder. Who had access to this house's mail 19 years ago? Who was living 2 miles away and coming by twice a week to help your mother with the foundation's paperwork? Marcus didn't answer, because they both already knew. Robert didn't confront Deborah immediately. He'd built a business empire on the principle that you never went into a difficult negotiation without knowing every fact in the room, and this was the most difficult negotiation of his life. So instead, quietly, he hired the private investigator he'd avoided hiring for the DNA question and pointed him not at Sarah, but backward, at the county records from 19 years ago, at the hospital where Sarah, Jane Doe, age 18 months, had been treated after the accident. What came back 6 days later was worse than he'd let himself imagine. The hospital had in fact made an effort to identify the unclaimed toddler in their care. A social worker's note from 19 years ago, buried in an archived file, recorded a phone call placed to a number listed for next of kin possible, a number that traced, through the phone company's old records, to the Halloway family home. The call had been logged as unanswered, no callback received, case referred to the county for standard placement procedures. Robert had no memory of any such call. He'd been in this house every day for months after the accident, sitting by the phone half hoping, despite everything, that someone would call and tell him it had all been a mistake. The number wasn't the house line, though. It was a secondary line, installed the year before, one Robert barely used, the line Deborah had set up in the guest office to handle foundation correspondence while Margaret grieved. He confronted her on a Thursday evening, in his study, with Marcus present because Robert did not think he could stand to hear it alone and did not think it was fair to make Marcus hear it secondhand. Deborah's face, when he laid the letters on the desk between them, went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, something that might have been fear, before settling into a kind of brittle composure that told Robert everything he still needed to know. I can explain, she said. I would very much like you to, Robert said. His voice was quiet. It was quieter than either of them had ever heard it, and somehow that made it worse than shouting would have. Claire was destroying this family, Robert. You know she was. Every time she called, every time a letter came, it tore this house apart for a week. You'd stop eating. Margaret would cry for days. Marcus couldn't concentrate at work. I was trying to protect all of you from a cycle that never went anywhere good. She'd apologize. You'd almost reconcile. Then she'd say something about that man and it would all blow up again. I thought if I just managed the correspondence for a while, until things settled. You told my daughter I didn't want to hear from her, Robert said. You let her believe for the last 2 years of her life that her father had turned his back on her completely. You let her die believing that. I didn't know she was going to die, Robert. Nobody could have known that. And the hospital's call, 19 years ago, about a Jane Doe toddler who might belong to this family. Robert's hand, flat on the desk, was steady now, steadier than it had been in weeks, because something about finally having the whole shape of the thing in front of him had burned away the shaking and left only a cold, clear fury underneath. You took that call, didn't you? The silence that followed lasted long enough that Marcus, standing by the window, made a sound like something had been physically knocked out of him. I didn't know it was her, Deborah said, and her voice had started to shake now, finally, the composure cracking. I swear to you, Robert, I didn't know. A hospital called asking about an unidentified toddler heart accident we already knew Claire and the baby had died in. The county had already confirmed 2 fatalities. I assumed it was a clerical error, a mix-up with another family. I didn't follow up. I should have. I know I should have. But I didn't do it to hurt anyone. I was overwhelmed, Robert. Your wife was in pieces. Marcus was in pieces. I was trying to hold this family together, and I made a terrible judgment call in the middle of the worst month of all our lives.
You made that judgment call, Robert said, and then you spent 19 years never once mentioning it. Not when the will started coming together. Not last month, when I told you both I'd found a woman who might be Claire's daughter. You sat at my table and said, "Oh, Robert, that's a miracle," knowing exactly what you've done. Marcus, who had been silent through most of this, finally spoke, and his voice was low and unsteady in a way Robert had never heard from his son. "How long, Deborah? How long have you known there was a chance my niece was alive out there somewhere, and you let us think she died in that car?" Deborah didn't answer him. She was looking at Robert, and something in her expression had shifted from defensive to something closer to calculating, and Robert understood, watching it happen, that some part of her was already doing arithmetic about damage control, about the will, about what came next. And that recognition told him more clearly than any letter or phone record could have exactly what kind of decision she'd been making, quietly, for 19 years. The 2 weeks that followed were the ugliest of Robert's adult life, uglier in some ways than the funeral had been, because grief at least was clean. This was not clean. Deborah retained a lawyer of her own within 4 days, framed everything through him as a series of understandable errors made under extraordinary emotional strain, and Robert watched his son, his kind, steady 51-year-old son, try to hold together a marriage that had just revealed itself to be built, in part, on a decision that had cost a family 19 years and nearly cost them Sarah entirely. Robert didn't ask Marcus to choose. He'd learned over a long life that ultimatums rarely produce the outcome you wanted and always cost you something you couldn't get back. But he did, finally, sit down with his estate attorney and finish the will he'd been putting off for months. And this time, there was no ambiguity in it at all. Sarah Whitfield, his granddaughter, and Lily, his great-granddaughter, were named. The foundation's leadership structure was rewritten to require unanimous board approval, a board Robert now controlled the majority of, for any expenditure over $10,000. A provision his attorney noted dryly was unusually specific.
It was specific because Robert had, by then, found the second thing the private investigators' deeper dig had turned up. Over 6 years, nearly $200,000 in foundation funds had moved through a vendor account that, on paper, provided event planning services for the annual gala, and that in practice was owned by Deborah's sister. It wasn't a fortune, not by Halloway family standards, but it was theft, plainly and legally, and combined with everything else, it was the difference between a family rupture Robert could have quietly absorbed and one that had crossed into territory the law had opinions about. He didn't press criminal charges. That was the one mercy he allowed her, and he gave it for Marcus's sake, not hers. A quiet agreement, worked out through lawyers, in which Deborah resigned from the foundation's board entirely, repaid the misappropriated funds from her own accounts, and signed documents relinquishing any future claim to Halloway construction assets beyond what state law required in the eventual divorce. Marcus, 3 months later, with visible grief and visible relief in equal measure, finally filed. "I keep thinking I should have seen it sooner," Marcus told his father, the two of them sitting on the porch of the Sullivan's Island house on a gray Sunday afternoon, the ocean churning somewhere beyond the dunes. 26 years married to someone, and I missed something like this. You didn't miss it, Robert said. She hid it. There's a difference. I sat across the table from her at 1,000 dinners and missed it too. Marcus was quiet for a while. Then, Sarah wants to know if she can bring Lily by next weekend. To see the house, Claire's old room. Robert felt something in his chest ease, just slightly, for the first time in weeks. Tell her yes. Tell her the room's exactly as it was. We never could bring ourselves to change it. Sarah and Lily came the following Saturday, and Robert stood in the doorway of Claire's childhood bedroom and watched his granddaughter, a woman he had known for less than 2 months and already could not imagine his life without, run her hand along the edge of an old dresser that still held, in its top drawer, a jewelry box Claire had made in an 8th grade art class, and a stack of photographs Robert hadn't looked at in 19 years because he hadn't been able to.
Sarah lifted one out. A young woman, maybe 23, laughing at something off camera, one hand resting on a barely visible pregnant belly, her collarbone bare in a sundress, the birthmark clearly visible. That's her, Sarah said softly. That's my mother. It wasn't a question. That's her, Robert confirmed. 3 months before you were born. Lily, meanwhile, had found the jewelry box and was turning it over in her small hands with the careful curiosity of a child who understood, in whatever way 3-year-olds understand things, that this room mattered. Was this my grandma's room? Great-grandma's, Robert said, kneeling down to her level, his knees protesting the way they always did now. Your grandma Claire's room. She grew up right here. Did you love her? The question came out of nowhere, the way children's hardest questions always do, and Robert felt his throat close before he could answer. More than anything in the world, he said, when he could speak again. I made a lot of mistakes. I was too proud, too many times, when I should have just picked up the phone. That's the thing I want you to remember when you're older. Being right isn't worth as much as people think it is. Not compared to being together. Lily considered this with the total seriousness of a small child working through something important, then held up the jewelry box. Can I keep this? It's yours, Robert said. It always was. It just took a long time getting to you. It was nearly a year later, at a much smaller gathering than the gala where all of it began, a birthday party, Lily turning 4, in the garden Margaret had once tended, roses blooming again under Sarah's care, because she'd taken to gardening with an intensity that made Robert wonder if some things really did travel down through blood after all. That Robert stood at the edge of the lawn with Marcus, watching Lily chase a soap bubble machine across the grass, shrieking with the particular joy of a child who has never known a version of this family that wasn't whole. You look better, Marcus said, than you have in years, honestly.
I feel it, Robert admitted. I spent 19 years thinking the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing Claire, and it was. But I spent those same 19 years not knowing the second worst thing, that somebody I trusted took the chance to fix it and buried it instead. I don't know which one I'm angrier about some days, but I know which one I'm gladder to have found. Sarah came across the lawn toward them, laughing, her collarbone bare in the summer heat, the birthmark catching the late afternoon light exactly the way Robert remembered it catching the light on Margaret, on Claire, on 3 generations of women he had loved, and in one case, nearly lost forever to a filing cabinet and a decision made in a moment of fear 19 years before. She wants you to blow out the candles with her, Sarah said. She says it doesn't count unless her great-grandpa helps. Robert followed her across the grass, toward the cake, toward his great-granddaughter's small, insistent, joyful voice calling his name, and thought, not for the first time that year, that the truth had cost him almost everything before it finally gave something back. He had learned, late and hard, that the people worth keeping were rarely the ones who managed you the most smoothly. They were the ones who told you, plainly, even when it cost them, even when it was inconvenient, even when a birthmark on a stranger's collarbone was the only clue you'd ever get. He knelt beside Lily at the edge of the cake table, her small hand finding his, and together they blew out 4 candles under a sky just beginning to turn gold. And for the first time in 19 years, Robert Halloway felt completely and without reservation that his family was whole.